Hello, welcome to our last lesson on our community Bible study on the Megillah. We are brought to you by the First Christian Church of Fort Thomas, Kentucky. I'm Larry Smith, the interim pastor of the church. The Megillah is a collection of 5 short books in the Jewish Bible, all of which are also in the Christian Old Testament, but in a different order. All 5 of these books are used during worship and remembrances during 5 of the special seasons within the Jewish liturgical year. Our book today is a short story of Esther, a marvelous account of a brave woman's heroic actions, which saved the lives of numerous Jews living in the Persian Empire. Its plot could easily serve to create a limited TV series. It has twists and turns, sex and violence, hatred and revenge, honor and cowardness. Behind this charming story, there are a multitude of issues which we need to address before we get into the story itself. Textual issues. These are questions surrounding the nature of what is really the Hebrew text. What was the original text, the original manuscript, the original scroll? Every biblical book has these kinds of problems. There are almost no examples of any ancient writing that has been preserved in multiple copies where all the copies are identical. There are plenty of examples of places where scribes made mistakes and other places where they appear to deliberately alter the text. We have some of these issues in Esther. However, our major textual issue is that there are 2 very different text traditions, one shorter and one longer. The longer text of Esther has pretty much the same shorter text, plus 6 blocks of added material. Now, there are 3 logical possibilities to explain these differences. First, the shorter version is the original text, and the extra blocks of material were added later. Then, another possibility is just the opposite. The longer was the original text, and the 6 blocks were removed to create the shorter text. And then the third possibility, the 2 text traditions arose separately because the long version agrees so closely with the short version in wording and order, it is unlikely that 2 independent authors or editors could create 2 separate works that agree so closely in wording and order. This leaves the longer and shorter options. The consensus today is that the shorter version was created first, and the longer one added 6 blocks of material at a later date. The lack of significant theological content in the short version was enhanced in the longer version by these additions that have theological content. In our next section of issues, we'll speak more about these situations. Here it's sufficient to say that the shorter version does not even mention God. The longer version corrects that omission. A second reason why the shorter version was given preference was that its text was in Hebrew, while the only texts that contain the longer version, at least the ones that have come down to us, are in Greek. The Jewish scholars who established the Tanakh or Jewish Bible preferred the Hebrew version to the Greek. However, when Christians began putting together their Bible, they used the longer Greek version of Esther. Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians still use this longer section. Protestants rebelled against it and substituted the shorter Hebrew edition of Esther, the same version basically that's used by Jews. Because our study is focusing on the Megillah, we will follow the Jewish text of the book and use the shorter edition. There are theological issues involved that we need to talk about. Important theological issues such as God and Torah or law or Mosaic teachings, food laws, sacrifice, covenant, and even prayer are not mentioned in the shorter version of Esther. There are 2 references to fasting, which probably had religious associations, and that amounts to the entirety of the religious content of the shorter version. So that is an issue which attempted to be solved by the additions that we mentioned earlier. The plot of the story revolves around the relationship between Esther and King Xerxes. This relationship is orchestrated by her cousin Mordecai. That one would promote a young virgin who was his ward to serve as a concubine and later wife contradicts many people's concerns over moral behavior, especially when the man involved was a Gentile. Mordecai doesn't come off looking too well in this account either. After all, he is, I think we can say, pimping his young ward for some sort of benefit. When the tables are turned and the Jews are allowed to take vengeance on the Persians, not enough of them died during the first day, so Esther begs Xerxes, and he allows the Jews one more day of slaughter. In the end, the text says, killing 75,000 of their foes, but the Jews did not lay hands on the spoils. They killed people, but didn't take their property. There does not seem to be adequate time and energy for the Persians who were killed to have been tried and convicted in a legitimate law court. This becomes one of the most serious moral questions raised in the story. And then there are several historical issues that we can raise. Historians have discovered a relatively large number of historical documents, original documents from Persia. And we know a lot about its history and life in the court there. The biblical king is almost always identified with Xerxes in the Western tradition. Xerxes reigned from 486 to 465 BCE. The biblical account mentions a great feast held in the 3rd year of his reign, and this matches information that we get from Persian sources that Xerxes held a big feast before heading off to fight the Greeks. After his defeat by the Greeks, the Greek historian Herodotus said Xerxes spent much time with his harem. This, in a way, kind of parallels his dismissal of his wife and marriage to Esther in the 7th year of his reign. However, the historical problems outweigh the similarities. We know the name of Xerxes' wife. It was a mistress, the daughter of one of his important lieutenants, generals, Otanes. Even despots have difficulty getting rid of unwanted wives when they have such important political and military connections. And we know that she did not die young, leaving Xerxes free to choose another wife. In any case, she is not Vashti, who is mentioned as Xerxes' wife in the book of Esther. We have almost no biographical information on both Mordecai and Esther. The short statement that introduces Mordecai seems to indicate that he was taken into exile in Babylon with the first group of exiles, and they left in the year 597. As Xerxes governed between 486 and 465, this would make Xerxes over 100 years old, 120 or so, when Xerxes comes to the throne. Not a likely historical reality, though the text seems to clearly imply that he was older than Esther. We really can't tell exactly, but that would make him pretty old for the time. But the likelihood that such an old man would have a so much younger first cousin, seems terribly remote. Some interpreters solve this age issue by arguing that Mordecai did not come in 597, but that was his ancestors. Others argue that this is not the right Xerxes, but talks about Artaxerxes, who ruled about 70 years later. It's interesting to note, and raises questions as well, that Mordecai, the name Mordecai was widely used in the Persian world, and it is derived from the Persian god Marduk. Esther seems likewise to have been come down from the Persian deity Esther, who was known for her beauty. And so you have these two Persian-based names based on Persian deities, and it's not likely that these were names that were given to these individuals before the exile. These were names that would have been slowly admitted into the Jewish exiles after a generation or two or three or four in captivity. So these names themselves indicate that these individuals come from a time generations later than the exile. The extent Persian records do not mention our Mordecai or Esther, if he was such an important person to the king and she was queen, surely there would have been some mention in the surviving documents, but there aren't. Moreover, the Persians seem to have preferred to elevate Persians to such high positions. This would eliminate both Mordecai and Haman, the wicked villain of the story, from holding high government offices, and would also eliminate Esther from being queen. Earlier in time, the Persians under Cyrus the Great destroyed the Neo-Babylonian Empire and allowed all the peoples that they had conquered and exiled, including the Jews, to return to their ancestral lands. Cyrus even allowed the Jews to take with them at least some, maybe all, of the religious artifacts from Solomon's temple. It doesn't seem likely that the anti-Jewish attitude found among the Persians in the book of Esther was likely to have developed so quickly. Probably needed years to develop. The killing of the 75,000 Persians was a theological problem mentioned above, but it also presents a historical issue. There is no mention of it in any surviving Persian document. We would likely find some sort of notice if a group of foreigners kill that many Persians. Well, what can we say in conclusion about the book of Esther? The book of Esther is best seen as a work of historical fiction. While it may be based on some actual historical occurrence, however greatly and wildly exaggerated, as it stands now, it is difficult to count as an historical document. Such an interpretation goes against many Christian traditions which understand this book as a writing of history, and it's oftentimes classified in the Christian canon as a work of history. But on the other hand, several Jewish interpretations emphasize the comic nature of this work. When you step back from it and start to look at some of the absurdities, a feast that lasts over 100 days. You have the concubines and the wives of Xerxes spending a whole year beautifying themselves so they can spend one night with the king. The rabbis encouraged the irony and the ludicrousness of the parts of the story by adding comic interpretations to themselves. For example, when Xerxes demands that the queen Vashti show off her beauty wearing her crown, the rabbis argued that she was expected to appear with only her crown on in front of all these gawkers associated with the king. In the recitation of this work during Purim, a feast associated with this book, during the reading, the children would take noisemakers, and every time the name Haman, he's the evil villain, is mentioned, they rattle those noisemakers and yell out boos and other statements and so forth. It's a time of interaction, and it makes the account more humorous, I think. The book of Esther provides the only biblical recognition of the celebration of Purim. All the other festivals have some connection uh, with history and the books and so forth. But Esther is the only book of the Megillah that provides the biblical recognition for that celebration. Purim is called Purim because that's the word for lots. If you recall the story, they threw lots to see when the date of the destruction of the Jews would occur, and that throwing of the lots here gives this name to this festival. Here in this name, we see one of the ironies in the work, that the lots were thrown to determine which would be the auspicious day on which to destroy the Jews, and it becomes the day on which 75,000 Persians were killed. But Purim is a time of joyous celebration, gift giving, visiting, giving aid to the poor. Some rabbis allow revelers to drink alcohol until they cannot tell the difference between blessed is Mordecai and cursed is Haman. Some reveling. Despite questions of its historical validity, Esther has played an important role in Jewish life and culture. It has provided hope and comfort for Jews throughout the centuries, but especially during times of persecution, and they have been many. Despite the lack of the word God used in the writing, people viewed God as coming to the assistance of the Jews when they were threatened by Haman, and prayed and hoped God would come to their aid in their time of persecution. It's a work then in the tradition of Passover, and it's a work that celebrates liberation and freedom and life itself for Jews. I hope that you reread this story and reread it with more knowledge, and that you can get more joy and insight out of it after having heard this lesson. Thank you. May God bless you. Goodbye.